Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started with our joint committee session on the grants process. We, of course, have been working on this particular issue for a little while, seeking to provide some predictability, consistency, and equity with regards to our community grants process. It is clear that we have such a robust network of nonprofit organizations that provide such incredible, valuable service to our constituents, and we want to ensure that we can strengthen that process. I will only say that, I still do have memories of someone who co-founded a nonprofit organization, started in the basement of my home in Wheaton, and then grew that. Memories of trying to understand and navigate this process, and it is still vivid in my mind how it was never really predictable, at least for an immigrant who did not have a lot of connections in the county at that time. It was particularly difficult. And so what we want to do is make sure that those organizations who have been providing incredible service for quite a while, that there can be a sense of whether these organizations should be either part of the base budget in terms of their grants, and or how can we make it more predictable so that you can have perhaps multi-year awards, perhaps have one office that processes everything with clear guidelines, but also how can we ensure that emerging organizations or folks who maybe are really engaged in innovative approaches to some of our complex issues which change and can become more and more challenging at times. Those groups or organizations that may have some really innovative ideas, how do we then also provide access for those folks? So it's a tall order, but of course we have Ms. Carolyn Chen, who can lead all of this seamlessly, as well as, yes, of course, it's a team approach, as well as all the nonprofit organizations and community stakeholders who have been engaged in this for a while. And I really do appreciate everybody's participation in this. I don't know if my chair of HHS wants to make some remarks as well.
Thank you, Madam President. You stated it perfectly, as always. I just want to add a couple of things. Obviously, we know from year to year trends change, issues change, opportunities arise that we may not have anticipated. And so as we are in the transition of getting to a better place of more consistency, having an office that can better leverage resources, provide more administrative support, help identify federal grants or foundation grants that we can go after collectively as organizations, we also, through this transition, want to make sure we're continuing to support our incredible nonprofit sector and identify ways in which those organizations can address the growing needs that we have in our county in various areas. So as the Council President said, it is a juggling act, but I do appreciate all of the work that I know and many meetings that have gone into what we are about to discuss today as we head towards what I think is a better place than we are now. So look forward to the discussion and questions. Thanks.
And Mr. Waters, I also, do want to specifically thank you and OMB for participating in this. It is my understanding that this joint session is going to be focused on FY21, right? So why don't I turn it over to you, Carolyn, and you can just begin the process and we'll start.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Let's go Nats.
Yes, indeed.
I know that's why we started late.
Of course.
What you have in front of you is a one-page memo. I would just like to quickly read through it. Not every document in this packet is accessible online to people who have vision or hearing disabilities, so I'd like to just acknowledge that and then read this very quickly. So today we are meeting to review the community grants process and provide recommendations. On October 22nd, the Office of Management and Budget transmitted a memo to the Council President indicating the following. It's a progress update on community grants process from OMB since our last joint committee meeting on July 18th. It outlines 6 options for a framework for the community grants process and then a proposed implementation timeline. We are speaking about 6 items today that are outlined in their memo. 1, to combine the county executive and county council NDAs and to make tone changes to the cost sharing capital grants process. 2, to change the community grants process to be outcomes driven. 3, create a grants office to manage the process. And 4, create an Aspire grant program to help build nonprofit capacity. 5, create a grant agreement tool. And 6, move certain community grants to the base budgets of departments. The recommendation of council staff is in the box below in bold, and just 2 recommendations in 2 sentences. 1, the council staff recommends that in the departmental review of community grant contracts, we expand to fiscal year 18, 19, and 20. Into the base budget, or for a review of a 1-year contract renewal in our transition year, which I'd like to call the course correction year. And I think expanding to 3 years will help with more data to combat institutional bias. Next, the council staff recommends an application mechanism for new nonprofit organizations and new innovative programs to be included in review for fiscal year 21. This is important so that this mechanism, this transition year, is open to everybody. Anyone can apply, no matter what program or nonprofit organization or program you have. And that's very important that we don't miss a year on that too. Any questions on that before we go to a very quick 9-slide presentation?
Just, I would support that it also include an expansion of an existing program that, where there's a greater need that we had not anticipated before, but that it is already working. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a new program totally, just an expansion of an existing I know that's what we had discussed. I want to make sure that there's clarity.
The existing contract or existing program is under the departmental review in the 1-year renewal or into the base budget. So it's covered already by that. And the recommendation is to expand over the last 3 years so we capture the different funding levels that we've provided for different programs in the last 3 years in order to review the whole universe of data. So any existing program would be applying for renewal or moving into the base budget, and it would have space to increase services, increase funding if necessary. So we have our mechanism. It's expanding everything. And I think, yes.
So those that would be negotiated directly between the executive branch and the organization to enhance the potential level of service. Is that what I'm hearing?
So we're still developing the process right now for the review of the grants that currently exist, and the departments are reviewing and making recommendations as to whether they should be included in the base budget. So I think that, to your point, we can certainly take that into consideration as we're looking at these, if there needs to be an expansion of services. The decisions or the recommendations for those grants moving into the base budget will occur after the application, so nonprofits will have to apply for whatever application process we have this year, and that review will be concurrent with the review for the current applications. So we're still working on the nuts and bolts of that.
Okay.
And we're willing to talk to the nonprofit partners through our outreach efforts to figure out what the needs are.
So working out the details, but still very open to an expansion of existing contracts where there is a need. The executive branch is working out the details on what that process would look like.
Correct. The executive hasn't made decisions on this. He wanted us to hear from the council, and he wanted us to hear from the nonprofit community before he would make any decisions for his recommendations to move forward.
Okay.
And just to add on that really quick, the fiscal impact of that, I think that was the first question of the expanding from just looking at 1 year over 3 years to increase existing services. The fiscal impact, I quickly back the envelope, a swing of $800,000. So we're not looking at a very big a very big push just by including 3 years and being able to see the different funding levels that have happened.
Okay, so why don't we go through the presentation, and then what I'd like to do is open it up to discussing more in depth your 2 recommendations. I think it's important that even though there were conversations that were had, this is the time when we're having our public joint committee session and when we should be discussing specifics, and or if the joint committees have a different direction to go. So why don't we look at, watch the presentation, then we can get into the specifics and then open it up for my colleagues to see if there are any changes or any, other types of things. I just don't want the public to think that somehow there were like some pre-conversations that, specifically influenced those decisions, because that's why we're here in open session to do. So if you can proceed.
Great. So just to go over the goals today, which we already talked about, which is review the potential options to restructure the community grants process. That's from the memo that you have in your packet from OMB, and to discuss our recommendations. Just a quick review of the concept that we discussed in July.
Caroline, can you speak a little bit more?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, to talk about what we discussed in July. I'll have to go here anyways. Grants 1.0, which was last year, was a decentralized system, outputs-based. We are currently in Grants 2.0 of FY 20, 21, and 22, where we want to build capacity of our current institutional structures and our nonprofit community, and moving an overlap of 22 to 23 Grants 3.0, centralized system and outcomes-based. Next, we have done a whole lot of work, and I want to really give OMB and Josh Waters credit for this, to have a continuous stakeholder input feedback loop on this process. So we are ongoing in terms of engaging county departments, contract monitors, the nonprofit community, public-private entities, that includes Collaboration Council, Children's Opportunity Fund, Montgomery Food Council, all of those, council member and staffs, council central staff, legislative analysts, grants advisory group members. There's been 200 since the start of this of the community grants process, and I was able to make a presentation to the Community Action Agency, which is really great. We have a grants forum in partnership with Nonprofit Montgomery on November 5th. It's 9 to 10:30 in the morning at White Oak Recreation Center. Just a listing of the potential options again. I read them out loud. They're also in your packet, but I wanted to put it in the presentation. And we've split up these 6 items into 2 categories. One where there is agreement. That's item 1, 2, 3, and 5. Combining the NDAs of the county executive and county council grants, changing the grants process to be outcomes driven, creating a grants office, legislation tentatively scheduled for December, and to create a grant agreement tool. And you can have specific questions on the details. To the 2 points of discussion that we are here for today is item 4 and item 6. Creating an Aspire grant program to help build nonprofit capacity. It is very clear in every stakeholder that we spoke to that we need to put an emphasis on emerging organizations, new programs, innovative programs from established organizations. We need a mechanism. We need to be nimble enough for that. And the final item, to move certain community grants to the base budget departments. This is the year that's going to happen, an actual review of that, and in that sense, that's where the recommendation came from, to open up the universe to fiscal year 18, 19, and 20, to include that in the departmental review, whether it's in the base budget, at the right level in the base budget, and also to account for institutional bias in our process and institutions by gathering more data. Finally, create an application mechanism for new organizations and programs for fiscal year 21. That is also important. We cannot lose a year, even in this environment, to not be able to have anyone apply, and to have the time for people to come up with programs that can address specific needs in their community. So I'd like to quickly move on, and then we'll go back to this. Next steps, we will continue focus groups and information workshops. We are on the exact same timeline schedule as every single year: a December application launch, a January deadline, and we were on track to introduce legislation for the county grants office. That will be our next discussion with the council in November. And finally, just in case you want another update and you want to see us again, I've got January 16th reserved for another joint work session. Finally, I want to thank everybody on here that helped out with this particular phase. This has been a massive group effort, and I want to thank Josh Waters again. So let me go back to the slide that we're discussing today.
Okay.
Any question?
Yeah, so can you expand a little bit on when you talk about review, the departmental review of community grants contracts to include FY 18, 19, and 20? Can you explain a little bit more when you talk about the institutional bias? What exactly are you referring to?
It's referring to the fact that in these 3 years, there's been a transition of county executive administration as well as county council administration, and in our positions as council grants manager and OMB budget analyst. Every single entity involved in reviewing and running the process has changed. If we open up to the last 3 years, we will account and see the data for all those changes, and I think that would be helpful to be able to accurately assess what the need is going forward. I think just taking one snapshot of a year is just one particular leadership and employees that have been running this process, and I think opening up the universe will be able to account for all the staff changes that happened and also the process changes as well.
All right, and can you talk a little bit more about item 4 as well?
Oh, yes. The Aspire Grant Program? Sure, I'll start, you can add to it. So item 4 came about out of this executive work group to be able to have a focused priority in terms of really encouraging new programs out of established organizations and to support specifically small emerging nonprofits, the one-person shop that's just about to incorporate to be able to do something very focused in their community. This particular grant program, it was thrown out, Aspire Grant was an Andrew Klein discussion back in June. This might not necessarily have to occur this year in fiscal year 21. It is something that a grants office can administer in fiscal year 22, but we did want to address the fact that it's important. Every stakeholder has said it's important, and that's why the recommendation to create an application mechanism for new organizing programs should be also this year too, and we can do that.
So after discussing this with members of the nonprofit community, as Carolyn said, it became clear there is a need for something like this. But what we don't want in the county is the proliferation of nonprofits. We don't want nonprofits just being created for the sake of being nonprofits and doing things that current nonprofits are doing. So in working with, in having discussions with nonprofit Montgomery about what to do and how to address this issue, they suggested to create a grant that would build a capacity. So it would help the people to learn how to file the paperwork, to really understand the ins and outs of doing business as a nonprofit organization, how to apply for funds. So it's not to create a proliferation of nonprofit organizations, it's to help build capacity for those.
And then to add on that, there's 2 current public-private partnerships that we already have, Nonprofit Montgomery, who's here, as well as Nonprofit Village. There are capacity building programs and training that we already support, and we should support more in a more centralized fashion. And in Nonprofit Village, there's an incubator program for new nonprofits to help them in the process, and that's actually be funded by corporate dollars, and I think that we could leverage that program as well. So this
Right,
is not
so that was,
something
so
for...
that's what I wanted, some
Yeah.
clarification,
Okay.
because what I don't necessarily want is for us as government to create another layer since we already have these 2 amazing programs, so why don't we just strengthen them and provide them with more funding, because they really do know exactly how to address this issue of capacity building, technical assistance, and all that, and then prepare, obviously, these organizations, if they are successful, to access, right, the tax, the dollars to provide the direct service. So that would just be, at least from my perspective, feedback, because these folks know what they're doing, they're the experts. I don't think we should get in that kind of business necessarily. And then the only other thing I would mention is that as the county is rolling out this Business Connect programs in the Regional Services Center, there should be that nexus, maybe there already is, but we should definitely make sure that we're also providing that nexus, because these are geographically accessible centers where there might be folks who, again, like I was, who, are not necessarily totally plugged in, but they may be able to go there and get some information and say, hey, I think I can go ahead and launch my 501c3 and, get some help here in my community versus having to travel somewhere else. But I have some lights, so let me turn on to Councilmember Rice.
So I just wanted to quickly just say amen. I couldn't agree with you more about item number 4. I believe it's duplicative. I believe that, again, with the space and the great work that Nonprofit Montgomery is doing, as well as Nonprofit Village, it's incredibly important for us to support their work and lift them up. If there are things that we identify that we'd like for them to do, then we just let them know and give them the resources necessary to make those happen. We don't have to create another separate grant program to support that. And so from that perspective, they've done such a great job and already leveraged the relationships in the community that I think that's the best direction for us to go in. So I would agree with you wholeheartedly, Madam President.
Councilmember Friedson?
Thank you, Council President. I wholeheartedly agree with you on the capacity building, that if we have organizations that are currently set up that we're already invested in, that are doing the capacity building work. We've recently made additional significant investments in this current budget year, and I believe in the previous budget year, we should be leveraging what we already have. And I think the idea of this is to streamline, not to add a new layer. So I totally agree with both of you on that, and appreciate that. So that eliminates one of my questions. My biggest question on this is broad base. I share a lot of the interest that we have here of streamlining the process, of making things more clear, of making sure that we're focused on outcomes and that we're achieving what we want to achieve. I think my concerns are largely on the process, making sure that folks actually understand what's happening and when it's happening. I'm not clear on that, and so I've heard from a lot of nonprofits that they're certainly not clear on it. So just wondering, you mentioned that organizations wouldn't find out whether or not they're in the base budget until after they have to apply. So they're going to apply, then they find out if they're in the base budget. Presumably, some of what they're applying, they would be applying for money that is being considered in the base budget, so then that application would be voided? Or, I mean, how does that process work?
So if they're applying for, essentially if they're applying for renewal of their current services, the grant that's already funded through the county, through a review process, if that service is essentially moved into the base budget, the money from the community grants NDA would follow that service into the base budget. So that grant application would essentially just be funded in the base budget. It happens from time to time. In previous years, there's usually 2 or 3 community grants that have moved from the community grants NDA to the base budget. So it's not like the application is voided, it's just it's being funded through a different budget than the NDA.
And then, of course, there's positives and negatives of being in the base budget, right? The
Correct. And
positive is that you're in the base budget, which gives you some certainty, some level of certainty. The negative would be that if there are budget reductions, which we've unfortunately had almost every year consistently, that they would be subject to those. Is that
That's correct.
accurate?
And Leslie McDonald from Nonprofit Montgomery can attest that every time I talk about this to one of her groups and forums, I repeat my 5 talking points, and that's included in there.
Sure.
The other thing I would say is just because it moves to the base budget, the idea is it would move to the base budget for that particular organization for the first year. But as the county likes to compete funds out, they're not guaranteed that they would receive that funding in future years. The funding could be competed out to other organizations. Maybe it's the services are done in-house instead, if it can be done in a more cost-effective way that supports better outcomes. So just because money moves to the base budget for a particular organization for 1 year doesn't mean that that organization is guaranteed funding in the future. That's also something I'm very clear at.
Sure. So,
sharing with the
so the organizations that would be still part of the grants but not in the base budget, they would have an on-ramping for a few years, but the ones that go into the base budget would only have the 1 year. Is that accurate?
I don't know what you mean by on-ramping for a few years.
So we have a transition process that we're talking about here. So if they don't go into the base budget, what happens?
They don't go in the base budget, and then they're funded again through the grants process for FY21. The idea is that beginning in FY22, the new outcomes-based process will take effect, where could have, one of the ideas out there is that we could have rolling deadlines and grant application seasons for different outcomes. And those applications would be very specific for particular outcomes or priority outcome areas. And then they would have to compete for funding within those particular applications.
And can I follow up on that point? I think there's an advantage to shifting this process beyond after this year, and that's because there's some kind of thinking that if you're a nonprofit and the services that you provide, you shouldn't be funded the full amount of your service. As a contract with the county, if you're a business and you want to get funding for a particular service, you get the full cost of it. Right now, through these community grants, we are funding a very teeny percentage of the program budget, and it's not enough to get the services that we need. So if we change the way that we, run the process, give us enough time throughout the year, quarterly, you get your contract done in 60 days. I think with this competitive process, you will be able to request funds to provide the full service. And if there's another year, that's a 3% increase in administration costs. Right now, we fund a lot of organizations at a very small percentage, and we're not getting the outcomes and the deliverables that we need.
I think that's an important point. You raised earlier that if we add all 3 of the years together, that it would only add $800,000 back of the envelope.
It's a swing, yeah.
Yeah, so can I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So if we take all the organizations that received community grants over the last 3 years, it would only add $800,000 to what was appropriated last year to the organizations last year. There's only a net difference over those 3 years of $800,000.
Well, the difference, if you, and I'm just going to go through the structure a little, just really quickly. So the county executive side did not cut any grant contracts over the last 3 years or prior thereof. The changes that happen are on the council grant side, depending on what funds are left. So the swing, while it seems like 3 years is a lot, the swing isn't big because the changes are really occurring in a $3 to $4 million range. And so when we're not looking at a $2 million swing, we're talking about under $1 million to be able to accurately review all the contracts that have gone through. And mind you, none of these contracts are being funded fully. So the swing just might be the amount that we've been funding people at a current level, that's just a percentage. But if you want the actual service, that's a lot more.
Got it. So the 800,000, so literally we're only
Yes.
talking about a net increase, even if we add the other
You
2
can't
years,
hold us
which,
to that, you know that, but.
no,
Back of the
order
envelope-
of magnitude
Yeah, order
is
of
what I'm
magnitude
looking
is
for.
under $1 million.
Because I was concerned as I was reading through it before you said that about whether or not we were setting unrealistic expectations on the, as you mentioned earlier, the rolling application that you could apply for the full cost of the service. The reason why we don't fund the full service partially is because we can't afford to do that. I'm concerned about the 3 years only because I don't want to set unrealistic expectations to the community and then us not have the money that we're able to appropriate in order to fulfill what we've set out at the beginning of the process.
So historically, community grants, the vast majority of grants that are funded annually are essentially renewal grants. Most don't receive an increase, or if they do receive an increase from prior year, it's a very small increase. So the difference would just be the grants that have fallen off over the past 3 years for whatever reason.
Okay.
And you're right about the setting the expectations part. The issue here is to transition away from, partially funding things and to understand that these are contract for services that supplement the outcomes and the priorities of particular departments. As I have understood, we contract with nonprofit communities under departments in order to provide services that the county cannot afford or can do, or nonprofits can do at a lesser cost. So it's switching over to our procurement and current contracting process under departments that says, hey, we need this service. We're in contract you for that service. It's the whole service. It's not 10,000 of your $100,000 app.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in theory. I think I'm just concerned about whether or not if we fund that full service for all the services that we're currently doing, we don't have the money to afford to do that. So then we're going to have to, I think the more accurate way to look at that would be we're either going to do the full service or no service. And so some will lose and some will gain. But, that's the more realistic. Then we're going to be able to fund the full service. But I understand the point. It is a reasonable point. These are nonprofit businesses, and they do have to pay their bills. I'm also just wondering about, part of the role of this whole process, or part of the objective, at least from what I had understood as I came into it partway through, which is realistically what those of us who showed up here knew, we're coming into a change that was evolving as we showed up, was to eliminate the issue where the executive had the executive's grants and the council had the council grants, and whether or not that was a fair, even, equitable split or not, which it hasn't been. But I am a little bit concerned and wondering what the council's role in reviewing this realistically. Even though ultimately we appropriate the budget, if there's an executive branch grants office that is reviewing this, if the executive is determining what does and doesn't go into the base budget, if it comes to us in a public forum before we have a chance to review it, realistically, the council is not really participating in the process in any meaningful way. Maybe that's the goal here, and that's a reasonable, policy objective, but I just want to understand what the council's role will be, either by deputizing staff or a community-based or group, or by doing it ourselves, or if there is no role of the council in this process anymore at all.
So in terms of moving forward, so beginning in FY '22, when the proposed outcomes-based approach takes place, the idea is that the council and executive would agree to an overall pot of funding for community grants. And the council and the executive will agree to how that money will be prioritized through specific outcomes, say for food security grants or for funding within a specific priority outcome, one of the executive 7 priority outcomes. That can be agreed to between the council and the executive and approved in the annual appropriation for the community grants budget. As far as the review process is concerned for those, I mean, that's something, again, that we want to work with council and the nonprofit community to create a process. So I don't think that, I don't think the executive branch would be opposed to having council staff, on the review panels for the grants or communication with the council about those. And then the idea would be that for those that become non-competitive contracts, they would be added to Section G, the budget resolution, which lists the non-competitive contracts, which has to be approved by council. So there are a couple of places in there for council input and council staff input into the process.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I appreciate that. I think, to me, the process is the policy when we're talking about this. I mean, I don't think anything else matters besides what the process is and how we set up the process. Realistically, once a nonprofit has been provided a grant, and this is the case too, I mean, technically, the council could have cut significant numbers of the county executive's grants. It's our budget, as the charter states, but that doesn't happen because the reality is, that just is not a likely outcome. And so I want to be both realistic that yes, there is an input at what you're talking about once it comes over at Section G, but realistically, once the decisions have been made, it seems that the likelihood for council input there would be limited, if existent at all. But I appreciate that. I do want to make sure that as we figure out this process, that it is an appropriate review team, that who is deciding, how they're deciding, what the process is, that the council is aware of that we don't approve this until we actually know that, and that is firmed up, and I don't think it sounds firmed up yet at all, which is okay, and that the community understands, because I'm still curious, based on what has been said, if you're a nonprofit and you're not part of Nonprofit Montgomery, and you don't have a lobbyist, how would you know about what's happening here? These are pretty significant changes. What are we doing to make sure that those folks are aware, that we're talking to them, that everybody who's ever applied understands how they can apply, and these new organizations that we're talking about, how are we talking to them to let them know that we might have a new process for them to apply for?
So in terms of going back to your previous point, I mean, that was looking at the transition is very important for this process to be successful, and that became very clear once our work group started talking, and especially once we started doing our initial outreach to the nonprofit community, which is why we, one of the recommendations or ideas in here is to build in that transition year where we can get input from the council and the stakeholders and county government employees who are administering these contracts. In terms of outreach efforts, right now we do have the forum on November 5th with Nonprofit Montgomery. We are setting up 5 focus groups over the next month and a half, 2 months, to meet with individual nonprofits and get direct feedback from them on specific ideas. While we are coordinating these with Nonprofit Montgomery, the focus groups, it's not exclusive to Nonprofit Montgomery members. And when those get scheduled and the people can volunteer to participate in those, we will send out notification via our grants portal, which has all the contact information for anyone who's ever registered to apply for a community grant. So we have well over 1,300 or 1,400 people in the system, so we'll send out a notice via that way. And when people have called and asked me questions over the summer, over the past year about the changes, I've encouraged them to go to the county's grants portal and register with their contact information so they can receive that information.
So could I just make a plug for everybody involved? We have a website. The website is not updated to have any of this information. It doesn't have today's discussion on it. It doesn't have the November 5th conversation on it. Doesn't have any information about the fact that we could be making wholesale changes to the process. So I appreciate that on an ad hoc basis that we're letting people know about the portal and that we're going to be sending out emails to 1,300 people on the email list, but, I think we need to have
So you're looking-
information on the website, and I think that will help us so that we can direct people to one place that has all the information with all the contacts, and, I think, we're gonna be getting, I think, more and more information, questions on this, and I think having a one-stop place for everybody involved would be helpful.
So there's, I'll address the communications and marketing strategy in the second part. The first part I want to start is your review on council input on the process. So this budget portfolio, community grants, is the only budget portfolio that is run the way that it has been run for the last decade, meaning we have two separate processes and two separate branches, and this is clearly an executive branch function. With that in our transition year, this grants office, which you said, is set up as an administrative management office. The decisions are not made by this office. The office is just running a consistent process for any type of county grant. The review and the decision is still up to the experts, the contract monitors, the departments, and citizens on our boards and commissions, as well as any grants advisory group people. So it'll be just consistent no matter what. No matter if you come in and you apply for any kind of grant, any department, that's the vision of the grants office. So the input from the council, what we're trying to shift to is our current budget mechanisms that we already have placed for every other portfolio in our wonderful, humongous budget. The executive puts a recommendation forth on a budget on March 15th, and the council analysts review. So in our transition year, I've proposed that me at a minimum be part of any of the executive branch review team, and my job as a legislative analyst on the council side is to provide the data. So I have data from all the years on every contract, every application. I have split this up by department. I've split this up by portfolio. All the council central staff analysts will receive this information early, meaning next month, in order to be put on notice that these are the ones that we're discussing going forward. And then when the new applications come in January, they will also be informed way before March. So we are starting a whole 6 months earlier in terms of really understanding what this transition will look like. So that's on the council input part. The communications and marketing strategy, which is awesome, because I'd like to also put a plug. I've been trying to get a URL for our grants website, montgomerycountymd.gov/grants. So if anybody can just push that through, I've tried that with a lot of people. I need that URL. I've got Shrivelly here today, our council IT. We are ready to go. We'll put up a central website whenever you need it. We just need the URL. So that's why nothing has been updated. We wanted to do it right. We didn't want it on an executive branch site or a council site. We want it, so we're ready. There's going to be a timeline, links to this, links to the videos, everything you want. In addition, we usually run workshops, 3 workshops, info workshops that are in county facilities. Last year, we ran 7. This year, we'll run more, and the most effective ones we're actually presenting straight to the community and in organizations and at meetings where they're already at, whether it's churches, whether it's advisory group meetings. So that lift needs to happen, and yes, it's not just going to be me. I know Gabe's concerned, what if we need more people? Yes, there's also a plan to make sure that we have additional staffing for this. Straight out of Gabe's office, I talked to Beth about, we need to have a grants hotline. My phone number is basically a grants hotline. If we make that a general grants hotline, we staff and train people in order to answer questions and to be able to answer the phone after a ring, and then send an email. We have consistent information. We are also thinking of throwing up a script for 311 so that if you call 311, you know where to go, which is really just a website and the grants hotline. And finally, we will be providing collateral, marketing collateral and materials, info sheets and brochures, whatever you need for each council member office to be able to distribute electronically or in person, so that it's consistent information across the board. That's all underway. We just didn't want to, we wanted to focus this discussion on the important changes that we would need your input on, but that is all underway, and all those people are here. I've got Christine here, who's already drafted the legislation. She's there. I got the OLO people here, just in case you have questions, but we are running everything in parallel, and I can go into more detail or have another session if you want to know the full plan.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think my view is all of those questions are directly related, in the way that we're reaching out to folks, how this process is going to work. I mean, I'm still not totally clear on how I have a very broad general framework of what we might be doing, what we're thinking about doing, the direction we're looking at going, but I think but I think that the devil in this is absolutely going to be in the details, and I'm still kind of curious about what our process is going to be, and maybe that's a question for the chairs of, are we voting on this process? Are we going to weigh in formally on the specifics of this process? Or are we just creating a broad framework and then the process is moving forward. So my last question before I ask the chairs that question is, the packet mentioned that the executive branch was looking to do this, the council grants office, with little to no budget impact. Could you just explain how that would work?
So, the memo was just specifically speaking to the community grants administration piece of whatever grants office is created. So we're looking at different options, including, if certain grants aren't funded, perhaps that funding can be used to do the administration piece. As we review the grants, the grant applications for renewal, maybe they're not performing, or maybe they're not delivering the results that the county has intended to pay for. So that funding may be able to be shifted to the grants office. That's one idea out there. We're looking to see if, how many people will be needed to do this particular administration of the community grants from the grants office piece. Right now, I spend I'm the only one at OMB who works on this. I spend about 10 to 20% of my time on this, and this is Carolyn's job. So it can be done for probably one or two people to run a grants office. We're just trying to work through those details.
I appreciate it. Well, I think that's an important part of this discussion as well, so hopefully we can get some more specificity on it. I just want to go on record, after hearing what you said, that the idea that we would cut funding from nonprofits to pay for administration in a new government office really concerns me, and I would not be very comfortable with that at all. And if I had a chance to weigh in on that, I would be weighing in extremely heavily to say that that is not a good direction, because the outcomes that we would get from the government office overseeing nonprofits would be less than even a nonprofit that we perceived as not performing to the level that we would want. Something is better than zero. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be focused on outcomes. I appreciate this discussion, but I just want to go on record before I close saying that particular proposal would make me
We have some other lights on.
uncomfortable.
Just also, I just want to take a step back also to reflect on something, right? What is the total amount of grants in terms of dollars that we usually?
It increases by 1.2 to 2 million every year. We started at under $1 million. We're now at 15.
$15 million. Okay, within a $5.8 billion budget, right? Yeah. The idea is that this grants program that we created, and it was created a while ago, obviously, was to be able to provide some services that obviously the government was not able to provide. A lot of times it had to do with trust in terms of the communities that we're serving. So this is an opportunity for us to strengthen our outcomes, right? It is not a humongous amount of money, but the needs have really grown, and the profile of our communities have really changed. So when we're talking about this issue of moving to the base budget, and I heard, something to the effect that you cannot promise what's going to happen on a yearly basis or whatever, we need a major paradigm shift in terms of how are we providing services to our community. This is still being treated as if it's like a program to address issues in tiny little niche areas of the county where we're seeing some changes. Those little niche areas are now who we are. So the paradigm shift is that we can't treat this program as if we're trying to just, address things in the periphery. These are needs that we need to take care of because this is our population. I'm not even talking about demographic changes anymore. I'm saying this is our population. So it is incumbent upon us to seriously look at what are those services that need to go in the base budget because they're a core function of what we provide. They're no longer like nice to have, cherry on tops, core function. And we know that there are some programs that year after year, of course we fund because they've become core function of what we have to do. Those are the kinds of programs that are going to have to go in the base budget because it's only fair, and we need to take responsibility regarding this, okay? So the money that is then freed up is for us to be able to look at innovation because even within these established communities, there are issues that keep popping up or developing, et cetera. And we need to be able to have resources to address those so we can become nimble. Sometimes we're funding best practices that then we can, adopt and incorporate, et cetera. We can partner, right? I'll give you an example. The Child Care Enhancement Initiative, a bill that I introduced, literally is the replica of what I was doing in Centro Familia, literally. At that time, although I was told by HHS that I was ahead of my time, when I came for a little tiny $17,000 grant where I was supposed to replicate a whole entire conference in Spanish, but that's another story. At that time, it was sort of seen as a niche area. Not anymore. This is central to our early care and education initiative now, right? So what I'm saying is that if we're gonna try to figure out innovation, and if we're gonna try to figure out how do we best provide the services to our community, we need to make sure that this approach mirrors the need. So I just want to put that out there. And we need to depoliticize this, people. I mean, I don't necessarily want my fingerprints all over this process. We need to depoliticize this. We need to get real about making sure that we are fulfilling, the needs, and we're addressing the needs of our communities, and we are stewards of our taxpayers' dollars. So I think that's what we're trying to do here, is to paradigm shift, free up some money. The needs are great. Make sure we're giving our nonprofit organization those opportunities. And the ones that are providing core services, by golly, let's treat them like we treat our contractors, who we give them, predictability in terms of what is going to come through, and give them the stature and the respect they deserve for doing this work, which is really incredible. That's the goal. Now, is it super clear right now? This is a major reform. It's not going to be super clear at this moment, right? So I do think we need to take it one step at a time. And these questions are really, really valid. But I have to say, kudos to you guys, because you've really, really moved this forward quite well. And the answer in terms of what the chairs are supposed to say, our goal is to put in legislation. And we're going to be here every step of the way, looking at these goalposts and how we're achieving them, and how the nonprofit community is responding. But from wearing my nonprofit co-founder and all the pain that goes with that, and having to be meet payroll and all that, the idea is to help our nonprofit organizations provide a better fit with the needs that are out there, which are great. And I feel like we're still treating this as a kind of like parochial, tiny little pot of money. And that is not the goal. So I just want to say that, and we're not here necessarily because we want to cut corners. We're here to make sure that the resources are filling the need in our communities, and I think this council has been really committed to doing that. So anyway, just really wanted to say that. Councilor Bernas, and then Councilor Mank.
So the congregation says amen. I agree with all that very much. So one of the things that I have absolutely loved about this job as a council member is the unique perch that we sit on through our various committee work and joint committee work. It gives you a unique perspective to be able to see the whole county. And so I do think there's tremendous value in having concrete council participation as a true collaboration and partnership, because this is an all-hands-on-deck situation as we address the very complex needs that are growing within the county. And Carolyn is extraordinarily and talented beyond belief. But I do think there's an opportunity for us to be able to provide valuable impact or feedback that I think could help maximize how we're providing services. So that's something I feel pretty strongly about. With regards to outcomes, and building off something that the council president just said, so I totally concur with shifting a variety of these contracts within the base budget of the various organizations, because there is a clear partnership and continuation of their work that they can no longer do on their own. But I think that we need to be more deliberate in establishing expectations for what those outcomes are, and then providing the appropriate administrative support to secure them. There's a science to being able to track outcomes. It's complex. Do we do longitudinal studies? Is there a control group? And it varies obviously from program to program and from subject area to subject area. And so as we develop the capacity of the grants office and we begin to phase that in, I think we can't lose sight of making sure that the county has its own internal administrative capacity to be able to track these outcomes, and then providing the administrative support to nonprofits so they can track them themselves and really tell the story, and that it not just be outputs or what they're able to provide, but they need access to data that in some cases MCPS has, our housing department has, that they can't control. And so that's why I'm so supportive of a grants office, because they can help facilitate that. So I think that'll be important. And I totally concur with the council staff recommendation to, particularly in this transition year, establish an additional fund to help address those organizations that weren't funded last year, so they're not up for renewal. Those organizations that have a new program or concept that builds off of what they're doing and what they're working on, and a mechanism for them to be able to secure those funds. And as I said at the beginning, the opportunity for organizations, whether they're serving families in crisis. I mean, we had, we obviously, we've all agreed we have a mental health crisis going on right now. And so if that's just one of many examples, but if there's a program that is already working, but we would all benefit from expansion, not a new program, but a program that would benefit from expansion. Those are the at least 3 areas that I would very much support this additional fund help cover, acknowledging that there will be limitations in how much we can place in that fund, and then acknowledging that we still have to figure out what that review process will look like. But it is something I think it would be would be a good thing and would help us through the transition. And I don't think we should wait for the URL. I totally agree that in a perfect world, but I think this needs to be launched like next week. And if we already have the framework, while not perfect, I think we can add it as a page or an attachment to the council and executive page, with the hope eventually to get to URL. But we're all fielding questions, and you are too. And I think getting this information up as soon as possible would be helpful for everybody, and help through the transition as well. And with regards to capacity for the ability to be able to answer questions now, I do think that we need to figure out a way in the short term to provide some additional support for Carolyn and OMB, so that you are in a better position to field these calls. There are literally over hundreds of these contracts, and organizations are going to have lots of very legitimate questions, and I want to make sure we're put in the best position to be able to respond to those questions in a timely fashion, because obviously the budget process never stops, and it's already almost Thanksgiving. So figuring out how best to add capacity for you guys, I think, is something that will be very important as well. So those are the issues that I have for now. I'm probably going to have some questions later, but there are other lights, and I want to defer to my colleagues for now.
Councilmember Katz?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I agree with much of what has already been said. I have for years thought that we treat our most valuable partners, our nonprofit community, in a horrible way. I mean, not to say for the money side, but for how we treat them. You have to wait till sit in the audience in May to figure out what your budget might be able to get in the next fiscal year, and then really not pay you till September or so. And these are our most valuable partners. I've always looked at grants as being something that the government realizes needs to be done, and we realize that someone else can do it in a more efficient way. They already know the people that need it, the services, and all of those things associated with it. But yet we make you wait in the audience in May to tell you what you might be getting. It's just a horrible way. They can't figure their own budgets until we help them out. In many cases, we are their lifeblood. So I think that this is a very valuable conversation, and I think this is something that we need to continue. But I do have great concerns, and it's been mentioned, and I just want to go in the amen corner. We have a lot of amens up here this morning, but I want to get into the amen corner for the whole idea that we're going to, if you don't use your money, the government will use your money for a new department. Horrible idea. I mean, that's beyond, that's a horrible idea. What we also, I think we need to figure out that when something goes into the base budget, and we need to have that discussion as well, but when something goes into the base budget, does that money get subtracted off the grants that we were giving, or is that an additional money? How is that being perceived?
Historically, the money has always followed the grants. So
Okay.
it would have it's gone from the NDA to the base budget of the departments. Given the limited resources and the budget situation the county has found itself in previous years and likely in future years, it would likely be that if a grant is moved to the base, the money would follow it from the NDA.
But Carolyn, you said that it's been growing from whatever to 15 million today. So is that, the money that you're saying is the 15 million, is that the money that's also in the base budget?
No, so the $15 million increase every single year of the $1 to $2 million, that was a county executive and OMB decision of the last administration. Those funds were not accounted for in our portfolio review. They were not taken from the base budgets of departments. However, sometimes departments would be asked to eat a portion of the funds of a community grant because they're added at the end of the year. So by just briefly decentralizing, separating the process, we can move things to the base budget, no cost to anyone. We're not losing. The funds are already there. We're assuming this is funds that are already contracts that are already being assigned and managed, right? So it's not including base budget. We are also looking at how we as a departments support nonprofits already in contracts, as well as in community grants. Community grants is just one mechanism.
Right.
Every department has. So this is separate funds that can shift.
Okay. The other concerns that I have, and there again, we can keep listening. First off, for the whole idea for communication, I agree with Councilmember Albanaz that we should not be waiting to communicate. When you think back to our last budget and how poorly we communicated to our providers in the disability community about what could be considered, what might be being considered, it was really a very poor job on the part of the county. I mean, we did not do a good job, bottom line, and hopefully we're getting everything back in order, but we need to communicate as fast as we can, and if we can communicate better with whatever, then let's do that as well. But we need to communicate that as quickly. And then one of the other things that I went back and I was looking through, you read enough of this, you don't remember where you read it, but the idea that if somebody had a couple of years that they were receiving grants and then that they ultimately would need to not receive the grants or would have to do more fundraising or whatever. I think we need to have a good discussion about that. We're hiring somebody through a grant process or whatever, through a base budget. We're hiring somebody to do a job that we need done. And they might, and they are, they do a great job for that. But they might not be great fundraisers. That's not their job. Their job is to provide services to our residents in Montgomery County. And for us to say that if you're not a great fundraiser, that we don't want you in business, makes no sense to me. So we have to figure out another way for that as well. Not to say that we don't want people to do fundraising, and whatever they can enhance creates a better situation for everybody, but just to make it as part of what they have to do, or for us to keep them in business, I have great problems with. But I think the conversation is a good one, and I think we should continue it. Thanks.
Councilmember Rice.
So I just want to step back a bit because I remember this conversation many, many years ago. And the conversation always centered around when we first talked about what we would do with our grants and how we would stabilize our grants process was one in which we knew that there was work being done by so many in the community that unfortunately would always need to continue. The simple fact of us eliminating veterans homelessness and having it at functional zero still means that we still have veterans who go into homelessness and who we still need to work with. If we get to functional zero when it comes to chronic homelessness, it's the same thing. We're still spending money to maintain as well as keep the new and assign them with whatever they need to. So there's still money being spent. When it comes to food insecurity, when it comes to ensuring that we have people in the workforce who can learn languages so that they can be more productive, all of those things are going to continue. And so from that perspective, the idea with the base budget was to ensure that in perpetuity we would always have these services that we knew we would have to provide, and that there would be stability in the nonprofit world in terms of understanding that they didn't have to keep coming to us for something that they knew was continuously going to be an issue that they were addressing and that we would support them. That was the premise of how this whole thing started. And so I really want to be sure that folks understand that I don't necessarily, in some of the things that I'm hearing, feel that sense of assurance to folks that these kinds of things will continue. And that's what the objective was. When I was council president in 2014 and sought out the county executive, as many of my colleagues had done before, and tried to broach this topic about putting things into the base, it wasn't on a temporary basis. It wasn't to say, well, I'm going to fund Montgomery County Coalition for the Homeless. Well, I'm going to fund College Tracks. Well, I'm going to fund CASA for right now. But then 3 years from now, who knows? We'll see what happens. That was never the discussion on terms of what we wanted to see. Now, of course, obviously, as with anything else, people have to perform. There's no question about that, and that always needs to be the case. The results have to be there to ensure that they're doing a good job and spending the taxpayer money that we're giving them appropriately. But that being said, the whole idea and notion around a continuous competition, that hamster wheel of going round and round over and over again, was a waste of time for the entity as well as for county government. And so the streamlining process was always designed in a way to eliminate that and remove that from those who, for the sake of being older and more established, for the sake of having larger staffs who can accomplish a lot more than some of our newer, that would have that stability, and we knew that. And we trusted in them, that we saw, based on their history, that they had done a great job. I assimilate this to, in the process of buying a house, and there's a maintenance person who used to work on the house for the people who lived in this house before. From my perspective, in looking at the records and everything that's being done, I'm going to continue with those folks. They've done a great job, they've maintained the house well, and I'm going to keep that relationship because I trust that they've done a good job in working and keeping that the way it is. Same thing applies here. I'm sorry, do I have a question whether MANA's doing what they need to when it comes to food insecurity? No. Now, is it possible that at some point MANA may start to go in a different direction that may be different from the council? Certainly, and we can pull support if that happens. But the reality is that no one at this point has any question whether or not MANA and all of the other folks who are working on food insecurity aren't doing their job. We know they are. We stand there at ribbon cuttings and celebrate the great things that they do, but then yet in the same breath we want to pretend as though, well, maybe tomorrow it's going to be different. I think that's a bit disingenuous for our nonprofit community. And so I want to say that, again, what I want to signal to folks, which is the same conversation I had with many of them who came into my office when I was council president, who've come every year since then, and we've talked about this process, is one in which I want to make sure that we're signaling support and assurity, not this sense of, well, I don't know, and it kind of depends on what happens. At the end of the day, $15 million is 0.25% of our overall budget. 0.25%. I'm a big numbers guy. For me, that ain't nothing for what we get. When I look at what happens with that food, that food pantry that we just opened up in East County with MANA, and how much of a difference that's going to make in people's lives and the leveraging that they have for funds. When I look at McHale, who takes a person who's underemployed and who all of a sudden now gives them an opportunity because now they've mastered the English language to become a manager in that place where they were the line person before, and now they're much more profitable and don't have to rely on us for social services. Those are the kinds of things that bring us tremendous return on our investment. I mean, we can turn to Nonprofit Montgomery, Nonprofit Village, and they have all the numbers and the data for us in terms of what this investment in nonprofit brings back to Montgomery County. So let's not pretend that this investment doesn't reap the county much more than the $15 million. Let's not pretend that it doesn't save us when it comes to ensuring that folks aren't committing and aren't subject to recidivism when it comes to our returning folks that are coming from being incarcerated. Let's not pretend that it's not taking people off the street and housing them. Let's not pretend that we're not saving people's lives. And so from that perspective, let's not put a dollar on that. Let's do the right thing and make sure that we're signaling to folks that we're doing the right thing by saying, have the confidence in us. We're going to support you because we know that you're doing the right thing as well. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass?
Thank you, Madam President. So for whomever is watching, Montgomery County MD.gov/grants. What powerful people do we need to talk to get this thing done? Right? And therein lies some truth about this process that I and many of you all have gone through. And I'll get to that in a second. But first, I have just some general questions that have been asked before, I think, but I just want to reiterate because they are very, very important. How will this process move forward with the executive's desire to implement a 2-year budget?
So the idea, if the executive does implement a 2-year budget for the entire budget, FY22 grants would be for a 1 year. FY23 would presumably be the start of the biennial.
Okay, great. What criteria would be used to enter a contract into the base budget?
So I've asked the departments who are administering the community grants to take a look at the grants that they're currently administering. And if you look on page 3 of the memo from Director Madalino, well, it's page 3 of the memo. So I've asked each department to provide information on how long they've administered the grant, how the services provided help the department accomplish its outcomes, how it furthers one of the county executive's priority outcomes, and how it fits within that department's core mission.
Great. And to reiterate, if a grant moves to the base budget, it is for the services that grant provides, not a continuation necessarily of that nonprofit's work to fulfill those services.
It could be a continuation of services. It could also be that that nonprofit is the only entity who's providing those services, or they're the best entity to provide those services. In some instances, the services that are paid for through the community grants process augment services that the county contracts with that nonprofit partner for anyway. So that money could be rolled into the larger contract for those services. So it would depend on a case-by-case basis. And in those larger contracts, if the county does compete those services out periodically, then that money, if it moves into the larger contract, could also be competed out.
And so just to put a fine point on it, as outlined, if a grant moves into the base budget, it should not be that organization's expectation that that is there in perpetuity.
Correct. The services would be there, but not necessarily the money for a specific organization. It would depend on a case-by-case basis.
I'm just trying to be very explicit and succinct in where you are heading so that we all understand it in very simple language. Okay. Everyone's alluded to the communication. Glad the focus groups are there. Glad you're talking to Nonprofit Montgomery. Last point I just want to make gets back to the point I made in my first comments about getting a simple website up. And while we're talking about the grants process here and making it more fair, more equitable, more transparent, and making it so that the not-for-profit businesses that fulfill these services have an expectation and have the predictability so that they can function as businesses as best they can. There's a flip side to this process, which we are not addressing here, and I understand why, but that is the procurement process, which is probably just as big, or if not a bigger headache for members of the nonprofit community, and I speak from experience there. I've shared my thoughts on various occasions from the dais, but while we streamline all of this, we need to figure out how to make it easier once the contracts are there and the stability is assured, how to actually fulfill the work and get paid for it.
So if I could speak to that.
Please.
One of the items, item 5, that the group has identified is looking at creating a grant agreement tool. Right now, all grants or non-competitive contracts have to go through procurement, risk management, the county attorney's office. Nonprofits, when they receive funding from foundations or other sources, they enter into a grant agreement where they receive the money either on a monthly, quarterly, or one-time basis in exchange for providing the funder a budget, what their intended outcomes are, and then periodic reporting about how they're meeting those outcomes. So right now, with the current procurement process, the conversation between the county and the nonprofit partners is one about invoices. Did you provide me the right receipts? Did you perform these services? By moving to a grant agreement tool, it transforms that conversation from one about invoices to one about outcomes. So, and we're still trying to figure out how, it would need to be either a regulatory or legal change to implement that, and I'm talking with the county attorney's office to find out how to really go about and implement that. But it's one of the things that we have talked about as part of the work group.
Great, I'm glad the work group has raised this. One thing for consideration as those conversations with the county attorney and others continue is the different departments and agencies which manage the grants and currently do so in wildly different forms and fashion, right? And so if there is a desire to make it clear and applied across the board, having the ability to do so, cutting across all agencies and departments is going to be really important. Okay, Carolyn.
Quick, do I have time? Okay, quick response on the website. I did propose to use a different platform, so if I can just put it out here too. I'm gonna throw out, it's only gonna cost $250, and I can have a website up by November 1st. Just throwing it out, we can discuss it later. And that will forgo this process. Second, on the timing, as well as the strategy. What we're doing here, and I know we're going into details and it's important, but what we're doing here is changing the entire system, the big barge turning around. So with the timing about procurement is crucial. This grant agreement tool is your front line. It's a Band-Aid. It doesn't address the bigger issues. Our goal this year in having a renewal process is get this done in an adequate time so that any services that need to continue start on July 1st. I've heard that's a big lift, and if we can do that, then we're on good ground. Second, the idea that we can move the procurement to electronic and also have standardized review, all of that. I think that's important, why you need an administrative management office, grants that also works with procurement. I know, just shout out to Howard County, because I just talked to them. They implemented DocuSign last year for the first time for their grants, and it just killed all of their administrative time. So there are quick fixes that we can do, but you're right, we are focusing on moving procurement as well and investing in that, or else none of this will matter.
DocuSign, what a great 20th century technology.
Right? Maybe that's
Fascinating. Oh my gosh.
old school.
Holy cow. Well, good on you for finding best practices in Howard County or wherever as we scour the interwebs to find out how we can make things more efficient. I share the thoughts of most of my colleagues that this is a great conversation. I'm glad we're moving in the direction. The hand-holding with the nonprofit community is so vitally important. I'm glad so many of you are here and that these conversations and the communication is ongoing. But then I will end with where I began. You should not have to outsource or pay $250 for a website that we can do in-house. My thoughts. Thank you.
Cool. All right. So what do we have to do next?
So let's go to the next step. I'm too short. I can't reach it. So next step, just to reiterate, we're going to continue with focus groups and information workshops for a December application launch. Add to that to draft up what we're already working on a launch of a website, communication, marketing materials, hotline, all of that. I can get that to you guys and as our draft outline so that you can have a more clear understanding. Second, for the council, this will be your big charge until December, really, which is review draft legislation on creating central grants office, where we will include quarterly updates to the council, any type of particular departments that need to work with, all of the stuff that you guys were talking about. That's what we'll be working on, and we'll need your input to get that drafted correctly. And Christine, shout out to Christine is here. And finally, if you need it, and I don't know if we do, but I did want to throw out the January 16th date. Applications will be in by then, so we could give you a count, but not anything else. But I did want to hold it before it got crazy, so that if you really wanted to know what was going on, we have that saved. Anything you want to add to what our charge is?
Over nose, any thoughts? Looks good. Okay,
All right, so just thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Bye, everyone.
I appreciate this.